The name on the telegram burned in Hester Talbot's hand like a brand pressed against bare skin. She read it again, though she had already memorized every syllable 3 days ago in the St. Louis railway station, standing beneath the gas lamps with her traveling trunk at her feet and her heart somewhere on the floor beneath her boots. The telegram was short and merciless, the way truly devastating things always are. 6 words and a name she had spent 2 years trying to bury. 6 words that told her everything she had suspected and refused to believe, confirmed in ink by a man she had trusted with the whole architecture of her future. Edmund Graves was married, not newly married, not recently married, married for 4 years before he ever spoke her name, before he ever touched her hand in the lamplight of her father's study in Boston, and told her she was the most extraordinary woman he had ever encountered in his travels west. Married to a woman in Philadelphia who knew nothing about the brilliant botanist's correspondence with a young woman in Massachusetts. Married with 2 children who bore his name, the name he had whispered against Hester's temple like a secret she was meant to keep forever. She had kept it. God help her. She had kept it for 2 years while her reputation eroded around her like riverbank in a flood. While her father's colleagues raised their eyebrows at dinner parties, while the other women in her social circle smiled their careful smiles and said nothing directly, which was always worse than saying something. She had kept his secret and shredded her own name in the process. So she burned his letters. She sold the botanical specimens he had brought her from the territories, the pressed wildflowers and the dried seed pods, and the little cork-stoppered vials of soil from places she had never seen. She packed 2 trunks and bought a one-way ticket to a place that did not know the name Edmund Graves, and did not know the name Hester Talbot either. The poster for Harlan County, Wyoming Territory, had been pinned to the railway station wall between an advertisement for Dr. Morse's Indian root pills and a notice about a missing milk cow. The county was advertising for skilled labor, doctors, blacksmiths, teachers, and the word that had stopped her cold, apothecaries. The territory needed someone who knew plants, who knew medicines, who understood the relationship between root and remedy. Hester Talbot had spent 6 years studying botany and herbal medicine. She had apprenticed under Dr. Eliza Whitmore in Boston, one of the few female physicians in the city, learning not just the names of plants but their precise chemical properties, their interactions, their dangers, and their gifts. She could identify by smell alone the difference between wild bergamot and horsemint. She could look at a patch of ground and read what grew beneath the surface the way a tracker reads hoofprints. She had come to Wyoming Territory to forget a name. She had not expected to find a man who would give her a better one. The stagecoach from Laramie to the township of Dunmore Creek was 8 hours of rattling bones and swallowing dust, and Hester spent most of it with her forehead against the leather-padded window frame, watching the landscape transform itself from something familiar into something utterly foreign and electric. The Rocky Mountain foothills rose in the west like the backs of sleeping giants, their peaks already white with October snow. The grassland between shimmered gold and copper under a sky so immense it seemed wrong, like someone had removed a ceiling and left the room open to infinity. The other passengers were 2 cattle buyers from Cheyenne who talked loudly about prices, a minister with a bad cough who kept apologizing for it, and a woman named Mrs. Dora Finch who was going to visit her daughter and who had strong opinions about everything, which she shared generously and without invitation. Hester listened to Mrs. Finch describe the frontier with a mixture of horror and pride, the way people always described places they had survived. Dunmore Creek is a decent enough place, Mrs. Finch said, adjusting her bonnet. Not too rough anymore since they put in the sheriff 3 years ago, but wild, mind you. These ranchers out here, they run their own law most of the time. You got a man waiting for you, dear. No, Hester said. Family? No. Mrs. Finch studied her with unconcealed curiosity. Business then? Yes, Hester said. Business. She did not elaborate, and the firmness in her voice apparently communicated something that even Mrs. Finch could not argue with, because the older woman nodded once and turned her attention back to the landscape. Dunmore Creek in October of 1882 was a town in the particular stage of frontier growth that felt simultaneously raw and determined. The main street was broad enough for 2 wagons to pass without quarrel, and was lined with wooden storefronts that still smelled of fresh-cut pine. There was a general store, a livery stable, a telegraph office, a barbershop that also pulled teeth, a small newspaper called the Creek Courier, and 3 saloons, one of which had a painted sign announcing it as the Gentleman's Rest, which was clearly aspirational. The land office sat between the bank and the post office, all 3 buildings made of the same pale sandstone that gave the whole street a pale, honest look in the afternoon light. Hester climbed down from the stagecoach with her 2 trunks and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, breathing in. The air tasted different here. It tasted of pine resin and dried grass and something cold coming down from the mountains, something that smelled like the world before it had been complicated. She pulled that air into her lungs and let it do something to the tightness in her chest. The land agent was a small, enthusiastic man named Mr. Corbin Fry, who wore his ambition like a second vest, and who had corresponded with Hester over the past 6 weeks since she answered his advertisement. He met her at the stage office with handshakes and fast talking, and the general energy of a man who had sold the same small parcel of land several times, and believed in its value afresh each time. "Miss Talbot, a pleasure, a genuine pleasure. The county is in great need of your expertise. I can tell you that without exaggeration. Dr. Pemberton handles the surgical matters, but for plant medicines and the everyday ailments, we are entirely dependent on what comes in by supply wagon from Laramie, which is to say, we are half the time without what we need and the other half paying 3 times the fair price for it." He walked her to a small building 2 lots down from the general store. It was narrow and had a front window that faced the street and a rear door that opened onto a packed-earth yard where someone had once kept chickens, judging by the scattered feathers. "It's modest, Mr. Fry said, with the confidence of a man presenting a palace, "but the soil out back is rich, and the territory west of town, up along the creek itself, is absolutely abundant with wild medicinals. Echinacea, yarrow, elderberry, wild ginger, and I'm told there are varieties of native species up near the Hawkins ranch that nobody's properly catalogued yet." Hester was not listening to Mr. Fry anymore. She was standing in the doorway of the small building and looking at the wooden shelving along the walls, at the wide counter, at the iron stove in the corner, and she was thinking that this room could become something. She was thinking that she could fill these shelves with things she grew herself and things she gathered herself, and the people who came through that door would leave carrying something real. "I'll take it," she said. Mr. Fry blinked. "Don't you want to hear the terms?" "I'll hear them," she said, "but I've already decided." She signed the papers that afternoon. She spent the first night in the small rooms above the shop, which came furnished with a rope spring bed, a washstand, a table, 2 chairs, and a cast-iron cookstove that she spent 40 minutes figuring out before she got a decent fire going. She ate crackers and dried beef from her traveling bag by the light of a tallow candle, and wrote in her journal the way she always did when she needed to organize the world back into something manageable. She wrote, "I am here. This place is real. The air is different and the sky is different, and I do not know a single person, and nobody knows the name Edmund Graves, and nobody knows what that name cost me. I am 31 years old and I am starting from the beginning, and that is not a tragedy. That is a choice." She crossed out the last sentence and wrote it again. She needed to believe it twice. The first 2 weeks in Dunmore Creek were work and nothing else, which suited her perfectly. She spent her mornings exploring the creek corridor east of town with a canvas satchel over her shoulder and her field journal in one hand, cataloging what grew in the riparian zone. The late-season harvest was still rich. Rose hips heavy on the canes, hawthorn berries dark and waxy, stands of wild yarrow gone to seed but still medicinally useful, mint gone woody but fragrant. She found elderberry in the canyon shadows and brought back branches heavy with the deep purple fruit. She found white sage on the south-facing slopes and dried it in tied bundles hung from her ceiling. She spent her afternoons in the shop, organizing and labeling, making tinctures and infusions, preparing dried herbs into small paper packets with handwritten labels describing their properties and uses. She made elderberry syrup in her backyard kettle, a large batch, because she could already see the winter coming down from the mountains, and she knew what came with it. The townspeople came with their curiosity before they came with their ailments. Women mostly, at first, stopping in under the guise of browsing and ending up in 20-minute conversations about plants they had known back east or back in Germany or back in Ireland. Mrs. Dora Finch, who had landed permanently in Dunmore Creek with her daughter, became a regular visitor with a genuine interest in herbal remedies and an unstoppable tendency to relay what Hester told her to everyone in town, which turned out to be the most effective advertising Hester could have arranged. By the third week she was busy. A child with croup responded beautifully to her steam treatment with eucalyptus oil from her traveling stock and a chest rub of camphor and lard. A ranch hand with a badly infected hand wound responded to her poultice of calendula and comfrey, and when the infection cleared in 5 days instead of the 2 weeks Dr. Pemberton had predicted, the man told everyone he encountered about the woman apothecary in the little shop by the general store. She did not advertise herself as a doctor. She was careful about that distinction because it mattered legally, and because Dr. Pemberton, a good man and a reasonable one, had come to introduce himself early on, and she had wanted to establish that she was a colleague rather than a competitor. She was an apothecary and a botanical specialist, she told him. She did not diagnose. She provided plant-based medicines and preparations, and she would always refer anything surgical or beyond her expertise to him. Dr. Pemberton, who was 56 and who had been managing an impossible patient load for 3 years with limited supplies, shook her hand with visible relief. It was during the 4th week that she first heard the name Martin Hawkins. She heard it in the way she heard most things in those early weeks, through Mrs. Finch, who was in the shop buying rose hip powder for a tea she had decided would help her joints. "The Hawkins Ranch is the largest operation in the county," Mrs. Finch said, watching Hester measure the powder. "Martin Hawkins runs it alone since his father passed 2 years ago. 7,000 acres up in the foothills, running cattle mostly, but he started breeding horses as well, quarter horses. They say he's got an eye for it." Said Hester, who was trying to remember if she had enough beeswax for the lip salve she had promised Mrs. Garrity. "Good man," Mrs. Finch continued. "Quiet, doesn't come to town often, keeps to himself since Agnes Pickford turned him down 3 years back. She married the newspaper man instead, and a very good choice that was for everyone concerned, but Martin hasn't shown much interest in the social life since." Hester packaged the rose hip powder and tied the packet with twine. "Will there be anything else?" "He's not a hard man," Mrs. Finch said, which meant she had interpreted Hester's lack of interest as skepticism. "Some of these ranchers out here, they get hard. The land does that to a person if they're not careful. But Martin Hawkins has always been fair to his men and his neighbors, and his father before him was the same. It speaks to character." "It does," Hester agreed, which was true and which she hoped would end the subject. It did not end the subject, because 3 days later Martin Hawkins rode into Dunmore Creek himself and tethered his horse outside the general store, and Mrs. Finch materialized from somewhere to tug Hester's sleeve and point him out through the shop window with the urgency of a person identifying a rare bird. Hester looked, because it was easier than not looking. He was tall. That was the first thing and the most obvious thing. He stood outside the general store talking to Amos Greer, the store owner, and he had the particular height of men who have done hard physical labor all their lives, height that comes with a certain density, a gravitational quality, as if the ground under his boots was more firmly attached to the earth than the ground under other men's boots. He wore a dark canvas work coat and had pushed his hat back on his head in that unconscious way of men who forgot they were wearing it. His hair was dark and his jaw was dark with several days of growth, and even at this distance, Hester could see that his face had the weather-drawn quality of someone who spent most of his hours outdoors and made no effort to prevent it. He was, she thought, the most straightforwardly handsome man she had seen in a long time, in the uncomplicated way that men who don't know they are handsome tend to be. And then she went back to the beeswax calculation, because she had come to Wyoming Territory to forget a name and to build a livelihood, not to acquire a new problem of the emotional variety. But the frontier has a way of arranging its own introductions. The first frost came in the second week of October, earlier than the old-timers had predicted and hard enough to damage the late-harvest kitchen gardens. 2 days after the frost, a ranch hand named Pete Donnelly came into Hester's shop with a hand wrapped in a dirty rag and a look of acute embarrassment, which she had come to identify as the particular expression men wore when they needed help and had been resisting the idea for several days. The hand was bad. It had been cut by a piece of fencing wire a week ago, and the wound had closed over the surface while the infection moved deeper, and it was now red and swollen from the knuckles to the wrist and radiating a heat she could feel before she even touched it. "Who do you work for?" she asked, examining it. "Hawkins Ranch," Pete Donnelly said. "How long has it been like this?" "Few days." "Why didn't you come sooner?" He gave her the look again, and she understood that it meant, "Because I am a man and I thought it would get better, and also asking for help is somehow shameful," and she filed that observation away under the category of things she found both infuriating and pitiable about the male half of the species. She cleaned the wound thoroughly, which Pete Donnelly bore with considerable fortitude and only a moderate amount of foul language, for which he apologized. She applied a drawing poultice of clay and plant and leaf, and bound it firmly with clean linen. She gave him a small bottle of willow bark tincture for the fever that was clearly beginning and told him to come back in 2 days. "It's going to hurt tonight," she told him. "That's the poultice working. If the red streaking moves past your elbow, go directly to Dr. Pemberton and do not wait for morning." He nodded, paled slightly at the word streaking, and paid her 30 cents, which she suspected was most of what he had brought to town. He came back 2 days later with a noticeably improved hand and a man beside him. Martin Hawkins was taller up close than he had seemed through the window, and the several days of jaw growth from before had become something more intentional, a short, dark beard that made him look like a man who had stopped fighting something and decided to let it be what it was. He took off his hat when he came through the door, which Hester noted automatically as a mark of manners. "Miss Talbot," Pete Donnelly said, "this here is Martin Hawkins. He owns the ranch." Martin Hawkins looked at her with eyes that were a particular shade of brown that reminded her of creek water over flat stones, clear and direct, and carrying some depth underneath. He nodded once, the way men do when they have decided they respect something before they have determined exactly what it is they respect. "I wanted to thank you for what you did for Pete," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned patience from wide spaces and long silences. "He was fortunate the infection hadn't progressed further," Hester said. "He'd been ignoring it for a week," Martin said, sliding a look sideways at Pete, who suddenly found the dried herb bundles on the ceiling extremely interesting. "I recommended he come back today for a follow-up. If you'll sit here, Mr. Donnelly." Martin Hawkins stepped back and watched her work with the focused, non-intrusive attention of someone accustomed to observing things carefully without interfering. She unwound the bandage, assessed the wound with practiced efficiency, and was genuinely pleased to see the inflammation had retreated significantly. The skin was still tender, but the heat was gone and the red streaking had never developed. She cleaned it again, applied a lighter dressing of calendula salve, and rebound it. Keep it dry for 3 more days, she told Pete. No fencing work. I'll know if you've been fencing by the state of the bandage. Pete Donnelly stood and put his hat back on. Martin Hawkins was looking at the shelves, at the rows of labeled bottles and packets and dried bundles. You came from back east, he said. Boston, she said. She began cleaning her work surface. You trained there? Yes. I apprenticed under a physician and then studied independently for several years. She said it matter-of-factly because it was fact, but she was aware of the slight lift of his eyebrows that accompanied the word physician, the small recalibration that happened in most people when they realized the woman in front of them had more formal education than they had assumed. We're a long way from a supplier, he said. The nearest apothecary before you was in Laramie. I know. Mr. Fry told me. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, turning his hat slowly in his hands, and she had the sense of a man who had something to say and was deciding how to say it. I've got a crew of 8 on the ranch through winter. If any of them need attending, I'd like them to be able to come to you without worrying about the cost. I'll settle the account at the end of each month. Hester looked at him. That's a generous arrangement. It's practical, he said simply. She agreed to it. He settled his hat back onto his head, nodded at her again, and walked out with Pete Donnelly at his heels. She watched through the window as they crossed the street to where their horses were tied, and she noticed that Martin Hawkins put a hand briefly on Pete Donnelly's shoulder before he mounted up. A small gesture, almost nothing, but the kind of nothing that tells you everything about a man's relationship to the people he's responsible for. She went back to her beeswax calculation. Over the following 3 weeks, the Hawkins Ranch account produced a steady and occasionally dramatic stream of frontier ailments. She treated a rope burn, 2 sets of cracked and bleeding hands from the cold, a case of influenza that she managed aggressively with elderberry syrup and yarrow tea, and sweating protocols, until the ranch hand's fever broke cleanly on the 4th day without ever becoming dangerous. She treated a badly bruised rib from a horse incident, which she could do nothing about except confirm it was bruised and not broken and provide willow bark for the pain. Each time, Martin Hawkins either came himself to settle whatever small immediate charge was incurred, or he sent a note with the man in question. The notes were brief and practical in tone, but they were always polite, and they always said something about whether the previous patient had recovered well, which told her he was paying attention. She was paying attention too, though she did her best not to examine that fact too closely. The introduction to his land came through botany rather than medicine, which was appropriate, since botany was the thing she had come here for, and the thing that had been pulling at her since that first morning walk along the creek. Mr. Fry had mentioned, that first day, that there were plants near the Hawkins Ranch that hadn't been properly catalogued. She had written it in her journal and circled it and come back to it 3 times. She wrote to Martin Hawkins in late October, a professional letter, explaining her interest in conducting a botanical survey of the creek corridor running through his property. She offered to share her findings with him, noting that several wild plants with medicinal value could be commercially harvested sustainably and might represent an additional income stream for the ranch. His reply came 4 days later, in handwriting that was clear and direct, without decoration or flourish, like the man himself. He said she was welcome on the property any time she liked. He said he would have one of his men ride out to meet her the first time so she didn't get lost in the canyon country. And then he added, in what seemed to be an afterthought, that he had a section of south-facing slope near the upper canyon that always had something growing in it even in October, and if she was interested in late-season specimens, that was likely where she'd find them. She was interested. She wrote back the same day. The morning she rode out to the Hawkins Ranch was the kind of morning that the frontier reserves for October in Wyoming, cold and absolutely clear. The sky a blue so saturated it looked liquid. The aspens along the creek stripped to their white trunks, except for a few bronze leaves that shook in the wind with the particular energy of things that knew they were almost finished. The ranch hand who met her at the boundary gate was a young man named Eli, 17 years old and deeply serious about his responsibility to escort her safely, which she found endearing. The Hawkins property was, as Mr. Fry had told her, 7,000 acres, and even at the end of the long riding season it had a quality of abundance, of land that had been worked with intelligence rather than exhaustion. The cattle were coming in off the high summer pastures, and she rode past several groups of them, thick-coated and copper-brown, watched over by dogs that looked like they were made of muscle and concentration. Martin Hawkins was at the main corral when they arrived, working with a young horse, a bay gelding that was in the early stages of what she would later learn was called gentling, the slow, patient process by which a wild-caught or poorly handled horse learned to trust human contact. He was working with a long rope and his own body, moving in close and then giving space, reading the horse's responses with a fluency that was itself a kind of language. He saw her arrive and held up one hand without breaking the rhythm of his work with the horse. She dismounted and stood at the fence and watched, and she was startled to realize that what she was watching was beautiful in the precise scientific sense, the way a skilled process is beautiful when it is fully aligned with its purpose. After 10 minutes the horse stood with its head lowered and Martin Hawkins ran his hand slowly down its neck and the horse leaned into the touch. He came to the fence and took off his work gloves. "Miss Talbot, good ride out." "Good ride," she confirmed. "That horse was frightened when you started. He was bought from a man in Colorado who didn't know the difference between breaking and gentling. There's a lot of repair work to do." He said it without judgment for the Colorado man, which was a kind of judgment. He offered to ride up to the canyon himself, which she accepted, and they went up together through a landscape that was becoming more spectacular and more austere the higher they climbed, the creek cutting deeper into its channel, the rock faces rising on either side in pale amber and rust. Eli trailed behind at a respectful distance that suggested he had been given instructions about respectful distances. She found 12 species in the upper canyon that she had not yet catalogued in the county. She found wild rose hips the size of small plums, a late-standing population of echinacea that had somehow been protected from the early frost by the canyon's thermal pocket, a dense colony of Oregon grape root that was one of her most valuable antimicrobial preparations, and most significantly, a plant she had to get down on her knees in the frozen mud to examine properly, which turned out to be Osha root. She sat back on her heels and stared at it for a long moment. Martin Hawkins had been watching her from horseback for the past 2 hours with the same quiet, attentive quality she had noticed in her shop. When she stopped moving and just stared at the plant, he dismounted. "Something wrong. Something extraordinary," she said. "This is Osha root, Ligusticum porteri. It's a native medicinal plant highly valued in traditional medicine, particularly for respiratory infections and as an antiviral. I've read about it extensively, but I've never found it growing wild before. This is a substantial colony." She was already sketching it in her field journal, fast and precise, capturing the leaf structure and root crown. "Do you know if there's more of it along this drainage?" He crouched down beside her to look at what she was looking at. He was close enough that she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold air, the smell of leather and wood smoke and horses. He studied the plant with genuine attention. "There's a wet hollow about a quarter-mile up. I've seen something similar there in the spring. I always thought it was just a kind of wild carrot." She looked at him with the full force of her attention, which was considerable. "Can you take me there?" They found Osha root in the wet hollow as well, a far larger colony than the first 20 or 30 plants in various stages of the growing season's end, their roots still active beneath the surface. Hester Talbot spent 45 minutes in that hollow with her hands in the cold earth and her journal filling up with notes, measurements, sketches, and observations. And she was aware at no point that she had mud on her face and her hair had come entirely loose from its pins, and her skirt had a large wet patch at the knee from the hollow's damp ground. Martin Hawkins sat on a rock nearby and watched her with the expression of a man who has seen something he did not expect to see and is still sorting out what it means. He had started, at some point, to smile. It was a small smile, mostly in the corners of his eyes rather than his mouth, but it was there. When she finally stood and turned, she caught the tail end of it. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. Then, after a moment, "You're very good at this." "I know," she said without vanity, "the way you acknowledge a fact you've worked hard to earn." She looked back at the hollow. "I can prepare Osha root tincture for respiratory infections, which is going to be essential this winter. I'll need to harvest sustainably, take no more than a third of any colony per year. I'll mark the boundaries of both sites." "I'll have Eli map them for you when the snow comes," Martin said, "so you can find them again." She looked at him. "That would be very helpful, thank you." "The county's lucky you came," he said. It was simple and direct, and because it was simple and direct, it landed somewhere deeper than a compliment. She did not know what to say to that, which was unusual for her. She bent back down over her field journal and wrote something that didn't need to be written, just to have something to do with her hands. They rode back to the ranch in the late afternoon, with the mountains going amber behind them and the temperature dropping sharply as the sun pulled away. She stayed for coffee, because it was cold and the ride home was long, and they sat at the kitchen table in the main ranch house, a large, functional room with good chairs and a stove that had been burning all day and had built up a generous warmth. There was a shelf of books along one wall which she noticed immediately, and the books had been read, not displayed. Their spines were cracked and their corners were bent. "You read," she said, with perhaps more surprise than was polite. "I had a mother who believed in it," he said. He was pouring coffee from a heavy pot, and he did not look up, but there was something in how he said it that told her his mother was gone. "Mine as well," she said. "She died when I was 12, but the library she built for me survived her." He set the coffee cup in front of her and looked at her directly for a moment, the creekstone eyes carrying something more now. "I'm sorry," he said. "It was a long time ago," she said, "but I still think of it as her library." They talked for an hour and a half. She was not keeping track of the time. They talked about books, which led to talking about ideas, which led to talking about the territory and what was happening to it. The range wars beginning to build between the big cattle operations and the homesteaders, the politics of the railroad, the question of statehood, the treatment of the native peoples whose land this had been, and whose dispossession was ongoing and largely unexamined by the white settlers building their new lives here. She said this last thing carefully, expecting him to bristle, because, in her experience, men with large landholdings were not always comfortable with the moral examination of how large landholdings came to exist in the territories. Martin Hawkins was quiet for a moment and then said, "My father bought most of this land from a speculator in 1864. What the speculator bought it from before that is a history I've thought about more than once." He paused. "I've had Shoshone families camping on the south pasture for 2 consecutive springs, following older paths. I don't move them along. The foreman thinks I'm being impractical. I think he's being something else." She looked at him across the table. The lamplight was yellow and steady, and it caught the angles of his face with a candor that felt almost unfair. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" She thought about it honestly. A capable man with a large operation and a limited perspective on anything that couldn't be solved with cattle or rope. He laughed at that. It was a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind that a person stores away without knowing they're doing it. "That's a fairly accurate description of most of my neighbors," he said. "It is," she agreed. "Which makes you more interesting." She rode back to Dunmore Creek in the dark with Eli beside her, a lantern swinging from his saddle horn, and she thought about the Osha route and tried not to think about anything else. She was not entirely successful. November came in hard and stayed that way. The first real snowfall hit on the 6th of November and stayed on the ground, and Dunmore Creek pulled itself inward like a person putting on an extra layer. The saloon evenings longer, the church attendance higher, the general store doing a brisk business in things that could be stored and things that kept you warm. Hester's shop was busier than ever because winter was exactly what she had predicted. a season of respiratory ailments, of chilblains and frostbite, and the particular misery of bronchitis in people who had to work outdoors regardless. Her Osha root tincture proved itself spectacularly. She had made 2 large batches from her first careful harvest, and she distributed it with instructions and watched it work in a way that made her feel the particular satisfaction of a scientist whose hypothesis has been proven. 3 children with the first serious respiratory infections of the season recovered faster than Dr. Pemberton had seen in his years of practice. He came to her shop specifically to ask her about it, and she walked him through the pharmacological properties with genuine pleasure, because he was a man who listened to information and let it change his understanding. Martin Hawkins came to town the second week of November with a wagon load of supplies and the kind of deliberate efficiency of a man accomplishing several things at once. He stopped at her shop last, after the general store and the bank and the land office, and she told herself this was because the shop was at the far end of the main street, and it was simply the most efficient routing. He brought her a crate of beeswax from a beekeeper neighbor, because she had mentioned, sometime during that afternoon coffee, she tried not to think about too much, that she was running low and the supply wagon from Laramie wouldn't come until spring. She stood looking at the crate for a moment. "That was thoughtful," she said. "It was practical," he said. "You need it," he had extra. "You remembered that I mentioned it." He looked at her with those direct, stone-water eyes, and he did not say anything for a moment, and the quiet between them was of the type that has weight. "I tend to remember things people tell me," he said finally. She should have said something efficient and professional. She said, "I made Osha root tincture. I'd like you to take a bottle for the ranch. The men will need it this winter. What do I owe you?" "Nothing. You showed me the hollow where the root was growing. Consider it a fair exchange." He accepted the tincture bottle and turned it in his hands, reading her handwritten label the way he seemed to read everything, carefully and completely. "I've been meaning to ask you," he said, "whether you'd want to come out to the ranch again before the real cold sets in. There's a South Canyon I found in September that I didn't show you. Different aspect, different species. I don't know what's there, but there was something growing that I've never seen east of the mountains." She should have asked for more information, assessed the botanical likelihood, determined whether the trip was worth the time and the cold. Instead she said, "When?" "Saturday," he said, "if the weather holds." The weather held, and what it held was a Saturday of pale winter sunlight and hard cold and air like cut glass, the kind of day that makes the frontier look like God finished the painting and then kept going, adding detail and light past the point of any reasonable satisfaction. The South Canyon was different from the Upper Canyon. It was more sheltered, warmer, tucked into a fold of the mountain in a way that created a microclimate 2 full degrees warmer than the surrounding landscape. In that 2-degree margin, things lived that had no business being alive in November in Wyoming Territory. Hester found wild ginger. She found late-standing valerian root. She found a native variety of what she was nearly certain was Arnica montana, the traditional anti-inflammatory that European herbalists had used for centuries, and which she had never before found growing wild in North America. She crouched over it for a very long time, and when she turned to tell Martin Hawkins what she was looking at, she found him standing 3 feet behind her, watching her with an expression she could not fully read but which made something happen in her chest that she was not prepared for. "What is it?" he said. She explained. She explained the plant, its properties, its significance. She explained why finding it here, in this canyon, in this climate, was scientifically remarkable. She was using her full vocabulary because she forgot, sometimes, to simplify, and she watched his face for the polite blankness that appeared in most people's expressions when she stopped managing herself. It was not there. He was following her. Not just politely. He was actually following the science of it, the geography, the biology, asking the right questions at the right moments, the kind of questions that meant a person was building a model of the thing in their mind, rather than just nodding in the general direction of information. "How do you know it has anti-inflammatory properties?" he asked. "I mean, how does someone discover that about a plant in the first place?" And they were off, deep into the conversation, sitting on rock in the cold canyon with the afternoon light going gold, talking about the history of plant medicine, about the chemistry that underlies traditional knowledge, about how the Shoshone and other native peoples of this land had developed an extensive pharmacological understanding of local plants over thousands of years of direct observation, and practice a body of knowledge that was almost entirely disregarded by the white medical establishment. "And yet you're using it," he said. "I'm building on it," she said. "There's a difference." And I try to be clear about where the knowledge comes from. He was quiet. Then, unexpectedly, the Shoshone women who camped on my south pasture last spring, the older one, she spent 2 days collecting plants along the creek bottom. She knew exactly what she was looking for, and she was very specific about which plants she took and how much. It was deliberate, systematic. Hester nodded. It would be. Traditional botanical knowledge is generational and precise. It's not folk wisdom, it's accumulated science. He looked at her. "You should talk to her if she comes back in the spring." The idea lit something behind her sternum. "I would very much like to." "I'll make the introduction," he said, simply, as if it were the most natural thing, as if bridging those two worlds were just a matter of being present and thoughtful, which, she was beginning to understand, was how Martin Hawkins handled most things. They rode back in the long blue twilight with the stars appearing one at a time overhead, and she realized somewhere in that ride that she had not thought about Edmund Graves in 9 days. She had been counting in the early weeks, because the gaps were small and hard-won and mattered to her. 9 days was the longest yet. She thought about that, and about Osha root, and about the way Martin Hawkins had looked at her in the canyon when she was talking about arnica, and she thought that the frontier was doing exactly what she had needed it to do. She thought it might also be doing something she had not expected and had not planned for, and that it was not entirely unwelcome. The complication arrived on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of November in the form of a letter forwarded through the Boston post office. She recognized the handwriting before she opened it. She stood in the middle of her shop for a long moment, just holding the envelope, the way you stand before stepping into cold water. Edmund Graves was asking her to come back to Boston. He had, he wrote, resolved his family situation, this phrase which managed to reduce 2 children and a wife to a word meaning roughly a cluttered desk, and he believed that what they had shared was too significant to abandon to geography and circumstance. He still thought about her daily. He believed she was exceptional. He believed they had a future. He had written this from his perspective entirely, which was its own complete and perfect portrait of the man. There was no acknowledgement of what he had cost her. There was no accounting for the 2 years of letters she had written from her position of complete ignorance, believing herself involved in something honest. There was no mention of the woman in Philadelphia who was still presumably his wife, because resolving a family situation was not the same as actually resolving a family situation. Hester read the letter twice. Then she went to her stove, lifted the iron door, and put the letter inside. She watched it catch and burn, and was surprised to find that what she felt was not the grief she had expected. What she felt was something closer to relief, something closer to clarity. The letter was the last piece of unfinished business from a chapter that she had already, without quite realizing it, closed. She wrote in her journal that evening, he wrote, "I burned it. There is nothing left of that story except what it taught me, which is that I am not made for living as a secret. I am made for being fully present in my own life, and this is my life now, here, and it is more interesting than anything I left behind." She meant the botany. She was not thinking about Martin Hawkins when she wrote it. She was at least halfway sure she was not thinking about him. Martin Hawkins came to town the last week of November with the express purpose, it appeared, of asking Hester Talbot to attend the Thanksgiving gathering at the Whitmore homestead. This was a community event, she understood, an annual assembly at the largest table in the county, hosted by the Whitmore family, who had 14 people in 3 generations under one roof, and considered it their civic duty to fill every available chair with people who might otherwise spend the holiday alone. She was one of those people. She had known she would be, and she had decided she did not mind, because she had the Osha root notes to organize and 3 new formulations to test. Martin Hawkins came into her shop at 10 in the morning and asked her directly, in the manner of a man who had decided how to do something and then did it without circling the subject. "The Whitmore Thanksgiving is in 4 days. I'd be glad of your company if you're not otherwise engaged." She looked at him. "Are you asking me as your apothecary or as something else?" "Something else," he said, without hesitation. The honesty of it struck her like a hand laid over a wound she had forgotten she was carrying. She had become so accustomed to men who moved sideways, who said one thing and meant another, who draped their intentions in misdirection until you couldn't tell what was real. This man stood in the middle of her shop in his coat with his hat in his hands and said something else with the simple directness of someone who had decided that honesty was the most efficient path and also just the decent one. "Then yes," she said, "I'd be glad of your company as well." They drove to the Whitmore homestead together in his wagon, wrapped in blankets, with a warming brick for her feet that he had thought to heat before he came to collect her, which was the kind of detail that she recognized as evidence of a man who paid attention to the comfort of people around him. The road was packed snow, and the horses were steady, and the sky was a pale winter blue with mare's tail clouds high up that promised weather in a day or two. The Whitmore gathering was everything a frontier Thanksgiving should be. 14 people in various combinations of relationship, seated around a table that had been extended with every available plank in the house, passing dishes of roasted game and preserved vegetables and bread that smelled of yeast and warmth. Mrs. Finch was there, of course, and she caught Hester's eye from across the table with an expression of deeply satisfied confirmation, as if she had personally arranged the whole thing. Hester sat beside Martin and discovered that in a social setting he was slightly quieter than in their one-on-one conversations, not withdrawn but observant, the kind of man who listens well in a group and says things that matter when he says them. She watched him with the Whitmore children, easy and direct with them, interested in what they had to say in the way that adults who actually like children rather than performing their fondness for children are. She was making herself stop analyzing him. It was a habit of mind that served her in her work and sometimes ambushed her personal life. After the meal, while the men gathered near the fireplace and the women cleared the long table, Mrs. Whitmore pulled Hester aside in the kitchen with the efficiency of a woman who manages 14 people and has learned to take her moments. "Martin Hawkins hasn't looked at a woman like that since before Agnes Pickford made a fool of the whole situation," she said, rinsing a plate with the speed of someone who has rinsed 10,000 plates. "I'm not sure how he's looking at me," Hester said. "Like you're the most interesting thing he's seen in a long time," Mrs. Whitmore said. "Which, I'll be honest, is what the rest of us also think, but we're not single men in our 30s with 7,000 acres and a good character." Hester laughed, and it surprised her because it was the laugh that comes from somewhere genuinely pleased, not the polite version. "He's a good man," Mrs. Whitmore said simply, handing her a dish to dry. "And you are clearly a remarkable woman. I don't know what happened to you before you came here, and you don't have to tell me. But whatever it was, it's not the end of your story. This looks like the middle to me." Hester stood with the dry dish in her hands and thought about middles. About how she had come here believing she was writing an ending, or at least a pause, an interlude of professional purpose between one failed chapter and whatever came after it. She had not considered the possibility that whatever came after it was already happening, already taking shape around her in the form of canyon walls and Osha root, and a man with stone-water eyes who listened to her talk about plant chemistry like it was the most natural conversation in the world. On the drive home, With the night fully dark and the temperature dropped and the stars blazing overhead in the way they do in Wyoming on cold, clear nights, Martin Hawkins said nothing for a long time, which was comfortable rather than difficult, and then he said, "I'd like to keep seeing you, Hester." It was the first time he had used her first name. She noticed it the way you notice when a door opens. "You've been seeing me fairly regularly," she said. "You know what I mean," he said. She did know. She looked at the stars for a moment, the cold air pulling at her breath and making it visible. "I came here to forget something," she said. "I came here from a situation that was not honest. I was not treated honestly, and I was not treated with respect, and I have been in the process of recovering from that." Which is relevant because I don't want to walk into something new with the wrong expectations or with residual damage that affects how I receive things. He was quiet, and she appreciated the quiet because it meant he was listening rather than preparing his response. "I'm telling you this because I think you deserve to know it, and because I think you are an honest person, and I would rather be honest with you in return than manage impressions." "What was his name?" Martin asked. She thought about it. "It doesn't matter," she said, and for the first time she fully meant it. "He's gone," Martin nodded. The horses moved steadily through the dark. "I had something," he said after a moment. "That wasn't what I thought it was either. Different circumstances. Agnes Pickford was never dishonest. She just didn't love me the way I'd wanted to believe she did, and I held on to that picture past the point where it made any sense. It made me careful to the point of being closed, maybe." "What changed?" she asked. He turned and looked at her in the dark with a quiet certainty. "You came to town." She looked back at him. "Not immediately," he added, which was honest. "It took me a few weeks to realize what was happening." "What is happening?" she asked, and she was not performing uncertainty. She wanted to hear him say it in his straightforward, exact way. "I think you are the most remarkable person I've met in my entire life," he said. "And I would like the chance to know you fully and to be known by you and to see where that leads, if you're willing." The stars burned overhead. The horses breathed their steaming breath. Dunmore Creek's lights were visible now, the warm yellow squares of windows in the cold dark. "I'm willing," she said. She did not say it lightly. She said it with all the weight of the decision it was. December in Wyoming Territory arrived with a ferocity that felt personal. The first major snowstorm hit on the 5th of December and lasted 3 days, and left 30 inches of snow on the level ground and massive drifts against every building in town. Hester ran out of firewood on the second day and spent 12 hours burning the less critical pieces of furniture before Mr. Greer from the general store, who lived next door, appeared at her rear door with a sled and a stack of logs, and the expression of someone who considered this a matter of community survival. She treated frostbite cases for 4 days after the storm, and 2 cases of serious hypothermia, and a case of pneumonia in an elderly homesteader that frightened her considerably before it stabilized on the 6th day. She used Osha root tincture in doses that were at the upper limit of her confidence, alongside steam treatments and chest poultices, and she sent daily notes to Dr. Pemberton, who came to check on the pneumonia case and agreed that she was doing everything correctly. Martin Hawkins came to town on the day the road cleared, which was December 10th, and he came with a wagon loaded with firewood for her specifically, enough to see her through the rest of the winter, stacked beside her back door by himself and Eli in the time it took her to see 2 patients. She came outside to find them finishing up, her entire backyard transformed into a cathedral of split wood, and she stood looking at it with the specific feeling of someone who has been seen accurately by another person. She made coffee and they sat in her back room, which was her personal sitting room and workspace, and Martin told her about the storm's impact on the ranch, about the cattle they had managed to shelter, and the one fencing section that had collapsed under the drifts, and about a young horse that had broken away in the storm and been found 2 days later in a canyon, unharmed, which he said with the particular relief of a man who counts his animals the way other men count their money. She told him about the pneumonia case and he listened with the focused attention that she had come to depend on, asking questions that showed he understood the stakes. "You were frightened," he said. "Yes," she said. "I was." She did not dress it up. "I've never treated pneumonia alone before. In Boston, I would have had Dr. Whitmore beside me. Here it was just me and my reference books and what I know, and Mr. Hartley is 73 years old and the infection moved fast. But he's better. He's better. He'll be fine." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "But I was aware, those first 3 days, of the weight of being the only person who knew what I know in this particular place." Martin looked at her steadily. "That's what it is to be responsible for people," he said. "I feel it every winter with the men on the ranch. The weight of being the one who has to make the decision." "It's lonely," she said, surprising herself with the word. "Yes," he said, "it is." A pause. "It doesn't have to be, though." The sentence lay between them like the first real declaration of something, not the practical things they had been building toward, not the company and the conversations and the beeswax and the firewood, but something that looked directly at the core of the matter, which was that two people who had both chosen a kind of isolation were perhaps in the process of choosing something else. Christmas came, and she spent it at the Hawkins ranch. This had been arranged by Mrs. Finch, who had apparently decided to take a direct hand in things, and had organized a Christmas gathering at the ranch house, by the simple expedient of mentioning to Martin that Hester had no family here and mentioning to Hester that Martin did not celebrate Christmas alone if he could help it. And both of these things were true in ways that naturally produced an invitation. There were 8 people around the Hawkins table on Christmas Day. Hester, Mrs. Finch and her daughter Clara and Clara's husband, Pete Donnelly because he had nowhere else to be, Eli who was the same, and Dr. Pemberton who had been a fixture at the Hawkins Christmas since Martin was a boy. Martin had cooked, which she had not expected, and had cooked well, which she also had not expected, though she was aware this said more about her assumptions than about him. The roast was venison, slow-cooked in the Dutch oven, falling apart in its own juices, and there were preserved green beans and pickled beets, and a cornbread that Mrs. Finch had contributed, and several bottles of a very good bourbon that Dr. Pemberton had brought from his personal reserve. After dinner, while Clara helped Mrs. Finch with the dishes, and Pete and Eli were sent to check on the horses and Dr. Pemberton was asleep in the good chair with his chin on his chest, Hester and Martin sat by the fire and talked for 2 hours in the particular intimacy of a house settled around them in the way houses do when everyone is safe inside and the cold is outside where it belongs. He told her about his father, who had built this ranch from 300 acres and a stubborn certainty, who had read to Martin every evening regardless of how hard the day had been, who had died of a heart failure 2 years ago on a September morning while checking the south pasture fence alone. She told him about her mother, about the library, about the years of study that had been both a tribute and a way of holding the world at arm's length after the loss of the person who had made her feel most understood. About Edmund Graves, finally, more than she had planned to say, the whole arc of it laid out with precision because she wanted him to understand not just what had happened but what it had done to her, and because she trusted him with the information in a way she had not yet fully articulated to herself until she heard herself saying it. He listened. He did not say Edmund Graves was a villain, though the word betrayal hung in the room like smoke. He said, "You didn't fail at anything. He constructed a situation in which your integrity worked against you, and that is entirely his failure." She looked at the fire for a moment. "That is a very clear way of saying it." "It's the only accurate way," he said. She turned to look at him. The firelight moved on his face and she thought again about the word honest and about what it meant to be loved honestly, to be in the presence of someone whose intent was clear and whose actions matched his words. She thought about the beeswax and the firewood and the introduction to the Shoshone healer he had promised her, and the way he said something else without hesitation in her shop when she asked him. She thought about his hands on the young horse in the corral, patient and exact, knowing the difference between breaking and gentling. She reached out and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over and held hers, and the firelight went on doing what firelight does, and the winter went on being what winter in Wyoming is, and inside the house there was warmth enough. He kissed her for the first time that night, standing at the ranch house door before she climbed into the wagon with Mrs. Finch and the others. He was brief and certain and gentle, and she stood in the cold with the stars overhead and the smell of wood smoke in her hair, and thought that she had been right to burn the letter. January was the month when Dunmore Creek tested its residents' commitments, because January in Wyoming Territory was cold at a level that stopped being a weather condition and became a philosophical position. Hester's shop was warm and busy, and she had enough firewood thanks to Martin's generosity. She had developed a routine that included 3 visits a week to the homesteads and ranches within riding distance, which had grown out of the winter ailments, and which she had decided to continue because it was better medicine, and because the isolation of winter farming families was itself a health concern. Martin rode with her when he could, which was 2 or 3 times a week when the ranch operations allowed. They rode side by side through landscapes that were white and spare and dazzling, past frozen creek sections, and through stands of bare cottonwood that clicked in the wind, and they talked about everything. They talked about history and politics, and the question of what the territory was going to look like in 20 years, whether Wyoming would achieve statehood, what that would mean for the ranching economy, what it would mean for the native peoples who were already being pushed further and further from their traditional territories. She had strong opinions. He had considered ones. They argued sometimes, the productive kind of argument between 2 people who respect each other's thinking and are interested in being right rather than in winning. He was, she had concluded, the best intellectual company she had ever kept, which was not what she had expected to find in Wyoming Territory, and which was part of the reason she had stopped trying to keep a careful distance. In the 3rd week of January, he asked her to marry him. He did it at the top of a ridge above the South Canyon where she had found the arnica, which she suspected was not accidental. The day was cold and clear, and the mountains were behind them, and the whole county was spread below in its winter geometry of fields and fences and frozen waterways. He had his horse beside hers and he was looking at the view, and then he looked at her. "I know this is fast," he said, "by conventional measures." "By conventional measures," she agreed. "It's been 3 months. I've known longer than 3 months," he said. "I knew by the end of the first time you came to the ranch. I was watching you in that hollow with the Osha root, and you had mud on your face, and you were talking about plant chemistry like the world depended on it, and I thought, that is a person I want in my life for the rest of my life." He paused. "I told myself it was too fast, and I spent 2 months having arguments with myself about it." She laughed. "Who won?" "I did," he said, "eventually." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a gold band set with a garnet, simple and excellent, the kind of thing that was chosen rather than purchased by default. "This was my mother's. I had it resized in Laramie last week." She looked at the ring. She looked at the mountains. She looked at Martin Hawkins, this man who had gentled a frightened horse and found her Osha root hollows and brought her firewood in a blizzard, and listened to her talk about Edmund Graves without once making it about himself. She thought about the name Edmund Graves. She thought about coming to Wyoming Territory to forget it. She thought about how Martin Hawkins had, in 3 months, made that name irrelevant not by replacing it with his own, but by filling the space where it had been with something so much larger and better that the old grief simply had nowhere to live anymore. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." He put the ring on her finger, and she held his face in both her cold-gloved hands, and she kissed him with the mountains behind him and the wind in her hair, and the absolute, bone-deep certainty of a person who knows the difference between a mistake and a choice. They were married in March, when the first thaw came and the creek ran high and loud, and the south-facing slopes above town showed the first green of the early spring growth. The wedding was at the small white church on the north end of Dunmore Creek, and it was attended by approximately every person in the county who could get there. Because in a small community, a wedding is not just a private event but a declaration of permanence, a person saying, "I am staying, I am building, I am here." Mrs. Finch cried through the entire ceremony and then vigorously denied it over the wedding supper. Dr. Pemberton gave a toast that was funny and true and made Martin laugh his full, unguarded laugh that Hester had been storing away since the first time she heard it. Pete Donnelly and Eli stood up with Martin and looked appropriately serious and slightly uncomfortable in their good coats. The minister, whose cough had long since been resolved by her eucalyptus steam treatment, officiated with genuine warmth. Hester wore a dress of blue-gray wool that she had made herself from fabric ordered from Denver, and she wore her mother's pearl earrings, and she carried a small bouquet of dried rose hips and early willow branches, because it was March and the live flowers were not yet showing, and because they were beautiful in their own right. She walked up the aisle alone because she had no family to walk with, and she found this neither sad nor diminishing. She walked up the aisle the way she had done most things in her life since she was 12 years old, on her own terms, in her own time, with her own purpose. When she arrived at the end of it, Martin Hawkins was standing there in a dark coat with his hat in his hands, and an expression she had never seen on him before, an expression that was open and undisguised, stripped of the quiet reserves he kept most of the time, his whole face saying the thing he was about to say with words. She took his hands. The minister said the words that people have been saying to each other in ceremonies since before language was written down. Martin said his vows the way he said everything, directly, and with the weight of a man who means what he says. When he said, "With my name I thee wed," she heard it as more than ceremony. She heard it as the thing she had come to the frontier hoping for without knowing she was hoping for it. A name that meant something true, offered by someone who knew her fully and chose her anyway. She said her own vows with her eyes on his, clearly, and the room was absolutely silent. And outside, the March wind moved through the bare cottonwoods along the creek, and somewhere in the South Canyon, the first shoots of wild ginger were pushing through the snow. Spring came to the Hawkins ranch with the specific generosity of things that have survived a hard winter and know it. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving them exposed and steaming in the longer light. And within 2 weeks those slopes were running with new growth that Hester catalogued with the same systematic joy she brought to everything botanical. She set up a proper drying room in the ranch house outbuilding, a long, south-facing space that got good light and air circulation, and she began building a dried herb inventory that would serve both her shop in town and a mail-order operation she had been developing correspondence for through the winter. She kept the shop. She had never considered not keeping the shop. Martin had never suggested otherwise, because he understood, fundamentally, that her work was not an interruption of their life together, but the central feature of who she was, and therefore essential to whatever their life together was. She rode to town 3 days a week. He rode in with her sometimes. She stayed at the ranch the other 4 days and worked from the drying room and wrote letters and read and made her formulations and did all the things that constituted her professional life. And they were better done here, with more space and better access to wild plants than they had been in the narrow rooms above the shop. In April, the Shoshone family Martin had mentioned came back to the south pasture. He sent Eli to tell Hester, and she came out on horseback the same afternoon. The elder woman's name was Nabai, which her daughter translated for Hester as something approximating the healer. Nabai was perhaps 60 years old and had the quality of concentrated knowledge that Hester had encountered in very few people, the quality of someone who had spent a lifetime paying close attention to the natural world and had accumulated a depth of information that could not be compressed into books. They could not speak directly without the daughter, Wren, as intermediary, but they could communicate through plants. Nabai showed Hester 3 species she had not found in her survey. A native sedge used for wound binding, a small-leafed shrub with berries that Nabai indicated were powerfully antidiarrheal, and a lichen that grew on the limestone outcrops and that Nabai prepared by grinding and mixing with tallow to make a preparation for skin infections. Hester wrote everything in her field journal with the careful precision of a scientist who understood she was receiving something rare, and that the obligation was to record it accurately, attribute it properly, and use it with respect. She asked, through Wren, whether Nabai would accept payment or trade for the knowledge. Nabai listened to the translation, and then looked at Hester for a long moment with eyes that were evaluating and intelligent and not unkind. She said something that Wren translated as, "She says she is sharing, not selling. She says you know the difference between taking and receiving, and that is why she is showing you." Hester felt that in a place somewhere deeper than professional gratitude. She thought about the people in Boston who had looked at her botanical knowledge as something to be impressed by at dinner parties. She thought about the gap between knowing and understanding. She asked Nabai if she would be willing to return in the following seasons to share more. Nabai, through Wren, said that she would consider the South Pasture a place she came to, and that if the healer with the notebooks was there, they would continue. She said it with no more sentiment than the arrangement deserved, which was appropriate. When Hester told Martin that evening what had transpired, he listened and then said, "Good. Just that. Good. In the way that means both I am glad and I expected nothing less," and she loved him for it. She had been fairly certain for 3 weeks by this point, carrying their child. She told him in the kitchen after supper, with the spring evening light coming through the window and the smell of the horse barn drifting in on the warm wind. She told him directly, because directness was what they did. His face did the thing that faces do when someone receives the best news they have ever received in their life and has not yet found the language for it. He was across the kitchen and had his arms around her before she had finished the sentence, and she felt his heart against her cheek going very fast, and she laughed because it was the right response to an entirely serious thing. "Are you well?" he said against her hair. "Are you feeling well?" "I'm fine," she said. "I'm very well, I know what to do." She pulled back to look at him. "I am an apothecary with 6 years of training, Martin. I have delivered 3 babies in the past year. I know exactly how this works." He laughed, and it was the full laugh again, the one she stored. "I know you do," he said. "I know you do. I needed to ask." "I know," she said and leaned back against him. "I needed you to ask." The summer that followed was the best summer of her life, which she noted in her journal with a kind of wondering gratitude, because she had not expected to say that at 31, with mud still under her fingernails and a baby growing, and the frontier wind testing every board and nail of the ranch house on a regular basis. She had not expected that Best would live here, in this wide country, in this life she had built out of her own choices and an advertisement on a railway station wall. She rode less aggressively as the summer advanced and the pregnancy became obvious, but she did not stop riding, because she was not made of glass, and because the plants needed to be harvested, and because the women on the outlying homesteads who had come to depend on her professional knowledge needed to be visited. She made her rounds. She worked her drying room. She trained Mrs. Clara Finch's daughter to manage the shop on the days she could not be there, and Clara turned out to have a good head for it and a genuine interest that Hester was careful to cultivate. She expanded the mail-order business, which by midsummer was generating correspondence from as far as Denver and Salt Lake City. She sold dried medicinals and tinctures and a written guide she had assembled and had printed at the Creek Courier, a practical handbook on frontier plant medicine that sold 40 copies in the first month and had to be reprinted. She also wrote, that summer, a letter to the Botanical Society of America detailing her findings in Harlan County, Wyoming Territory, with specific notation of the Osha root colonies, the apparent Arnica montana population, and the ethnobotanical documentation she had begun with the assistance of the Shoshone healer Nabai. The Society's response came in September, an invitation to present her findings at their annual conference in the spring. She read the letter to Martin at the kitchen table. He was quiet for a moment, and then he looked at her with that expression she had catalogued most precisely, the one that was not just pride but something more specific, something that looked like awe at the particular shape of the person he had married. "You're going to go," he said. It was not a question. "It's a 6-day journey," she said, "and the baby will be 4 months old by spring." "The baby will travel well at 4 months," he said. "And I will be with you." She looked at him. "If you want me," he said. "I've never been east of Laramie. I'd like to see Boston." She put her hand over his. "I want you," she said. Their son was born on a December evening, the 22nd, the longest night of the year, which Hester thought was exactly right for a person who arrived with the specific, furious purpose of a new thing entering the world. The birth was attended by Dr. Pemberton and by Wren, who had taken to spending the autumn at the South Pasture Camp, and who had become, over the months since their first meeting, something that defied easy categorization: colleague, friend, a person who knew things Hester wanted to know, and who found in Hester a person who received that knowledge with the respect it was owed. The baby was healthy and loud, and had Martin's dark hair and Hester's particular expression of focused intensity, and they named him James Arthur Hawkins, James for Martin's father and Arthur for Hester's, who had been a difficult man in many ways but who had funded the education that had made her who she was. Martin held his son for the first time in the lamplight of the bedroom, while the December wind made the house speak, and the fire settled and Hester lay against the pillows watching him. He held the baby with the same patient precision he used for everything, and James Arthur Hawkins looked up at his father with the wide, searching gaze of a new person discovering gravity, and Martin Hawkins made no sound at all for a long moment, and then he said, quietly, "Hello." She watched him say hello to their son, and the frontier winter went on outside, and the year turned toward its shortest day and back again, and she understood with the whole of herself that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Spring came again. The thaw, the south slopes, the new green pushing through the last of the snow. The Osha root came back in the hollow as she had known it would, larger this year because she had harvested sustainably, and the plant had not been stressed. The arnica showed itself on the canyon wall in early April, yellow flowers brilliant in the pale spring light. She went to Philadelphia for the botanical conference, which had been moved to that city that season, and not to Boston as originally scheduled. She stood before the Botanical Society of America with James Arthur in a carrier against her chest, and Martin Hawkins beside her in the front row, with an expression of absolute confidence in the person at the podium. And she presented her findings in Harlan County, Wyoming Territory. She presented the Osha root and the arnica and the ethnobotanical documentation with precise scientific language and complete proper attribution, noting that the knowledge of traditional Shoshone plant use was the foundational layer upon which her work was built, and that this was not a footnote but a headline. The room of mostly male botanists was not universally comfortable with this framing, and she said so when questioned, and she said it without apology, and when the session chair thanked her and the room applauded, it was a good applause, the kind that contains both recognition and a slight discomfort, which she took as evidence that she had said something necessary. A botanist from Johns Hopkins approached her afterward with specific questions about the Ligusticum porteri colonies, and she answered everything, and offered in return to correspond about his work with Pacific Northwest conifers, which interested her for reasons related to a respiratory formulation she was developing. She and Martin had 3 days in Philadelphia before the return journey. He saw the city with the same focused attention he brought to everything unfamiliar, and she watched him seeing it, watched him calibrate the noise and the density and the accumulated age of the eastern seaboard against what he knew, which was wide sky and cold creeks and the sound of wind in the canyon country. On the second evening they walked along the Delaware River in the early April air, James Arthur sleeping in the carrier, and Martin said, "I understand now why you left." She looked at him. "Not that there was nothing here worth staying for," he said, "but the scale of it, the way it crowds the sky, the way every inch has already been decided." He looked at the city across the river. "In Wyoming, everything is still becoming." "Yes," she said, "that's exactly it." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his warmth, and they watched the river for a while, and James Arthur slept through all of it with the deep, unconcerned sleep of a person who had never had anything to worry about. They went home. The train west, and then the stage to Laramie, and then their own horses from the livery. And then the road to Dunmore Creek that she knew now in every season and every light, that she knew as she knew the faces of her plants and the rooms of her ranch house, and the precise weight of Martin Hawkins' hand when he took hers. The road came up over the last rise, and there was the county below them, the town in the valley and the creek catching the afternoon light, and the ranch in the foothills where the windows would be lit by now because Eli was there and would have kept the fires going, and the mountains behind everything, still carrying their snow, implacable and clean and very large. She had come here to forget a name. She had learned instead that some names are not meant to be forgotten, but rather replaced. That healing is not the erasure of a wound, but the growth of something larger and better that makes the wound a detail of the history rather than the whole of the story. That the frontier was not an escape but an arrival. That the shop she had built and the plants she had learned and the people she had made herself useful to, and the man beside her on the horse with their son in his arms, all of this was not a substitution for the life she had imagined in Boston, but the actual life, the real and complete one, the one that had been waiting in a hollow above a creek in Wyoming for a woman who knew what Osha root was and what to do with it. Martin Hawkins. Martin Hawkins, who had given her a better name than the one she had come to forget, not by replacing the name she carried, but by filling it with so much that was good and real that it became simply the name of the person she was, which was the person she had always been becoming. She rode down the familiar road toward the familiar lights and the familiar mountains, and the familiar life with all its work and its weather and its long conversations by the fire and its botanical surveys and its babies and its arguments and its hands-in-the-earth mornings and its exactly right evenings. She rode home. The first spring after their return from Philadelphia brought 2 more calves than expected, a bumper crop of elderberries along the creek, a second print run of the Frontier Plant Medicine Guide, and a letter from the Botanical Society inviting her to contribute a chapter to their annual publication on ethnobotanical medicine in the territories. She wrote the chapter at the kitchen table over 3 weeks in the mornings while James Arthur slept, and she sent it to Nabai through Wren to review and correct. And Nabai made 3 corrections and added 2 additional plants that Hester included with full attribution. The following winter was mild enough that the cattle stayed out past November, and Martin expanded the horse breeding operation to 12 mares, the quarter horses that he had been developing for 3 years. The first foal born from his prize stallion was a brilliant bay who showed from birth a quality of intelligence that made Martin quiet and deliberate in a way Hester had come to recognize as the expression he wore when he was in the presence of something he deeply respected. She stood at the corral fence watching him with the foal, using the same patient, exact approach he had been using for years, giving space and then coming close, reading the small horse's language and speaking back to it in kind. James Arthur was on her hip, 14 months old and entirely committed to the position that horses were the most interesting objects in the universe, which given his parentage seemed inevitable. "He's going to be extraordinary," Martin said, coming to the fence. He was talking about the horse, but he glanced at James Arthur and the sentence expanded to include both of them. "He gets it from you," she said. "Which one?" "Both," she said, and he laughed, and she handed James Arthur over the fence into his arms, and the baby grabbed Martin's hat and flung it into the dirt with the purposeful energy of someone testing the laws of gravity and parental patience simultaneously. She bent and picked up the hat, and there was the south pasture behind her and the mountains behind that, and the smell of the ranch in spring, of horses and new grass and wood smoke and the specific cold, clean Wyoming air. And Hester Talbot Hawkins stood in it and breathed, the way she had breathed that first moment stepping off the stage in Dunmore Creek, pulling the air all the way in, letting it do its work. The world was wide here. The sky was still the impossible sky. The plants grew where they grew, and she found them and learned them and used them and taught what she knew to anyone who wanted to learn it. Her son was in his father's arms. The garden behind the ranch house was already showing the first green of the season. The drying room was ready for the summer harvest. The shop in town would need her tomorrow, and she would go to it with everything she had. And the name she bore now, the name she had been given by a man who had chosen her because of her strength rather than in spite of it, the name that was hers now and her sons and the horses, and the ranches and the hollow where the Osha root grew, that name was good. It was honest and it was permanent, and it had been given to her not as a rescue but as a recognition, and there was no better way to receive a name than that. She was here. This was real. She had come to the frontier to forget a name. She had found instead the best one.